In the heart of Etosha National Park, under the wide Namibian skies where dusk meets dusk and the acacia trees whisper ancient secrets, there was a female elephant unlike any other. Her name was Nalia, a calm and observant matriarch with gentle eyes and a belly that grew more curious by the day. For months, the park rangers had been monitoring her closely, not just because she was pregnant, but because something about her pregnancy was unusual. Her belly was enormous, far beyond what they had seen in typical pregnancies. Nalia wasn't in distress, but she moved slower, breathed deeper, and spent long hours standing silently, as if listening to something only she could hear. Veterinarians from across the country were called to observe her. Scans were inconclusive, too deep in the wild for modern tools to work perfectly, and too sacred a moment for interference. The team, led by a seasoned biologist named Dr. Lena Quinn, installed a discreet GPS collar on Nalia months earlier, just to ensure they could find her if something happened. What none of them expected was that something was about to happen today. That morning, the sun rose with a strange stillness. The plains were quiet, too quiet. Birds didn't chirp. The breeze barely stirred the grasses. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. Nalia had separated from her herd. Rangers found her standing beneath a marula tree, her massive frame unmoving, her ears gently flapping, her breathing slow and rhythmic. Dr. Lena Quinn, watching from a safe distance, whispered into her radio, "It's time." Two rangers, Temba and Lucas, moved into position, their binoculars trained on the scene. And then it began. Nalia groaned, low, guttural, ancient. She shifted her weight and slowly knelt into the soft, warm dust. The rangers had seen many elephant births before, but nothing prepared them for what they were about to witness. The delivery lasted longer than usual. The sounds Nalia made were more intense, and at one point, she let out a trumpet so piercing it echoed across the plains and startled a distant wildebeest herd into running. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a small figure slid gently onto the earth, covered in a thin membrane, eyes still closed, trunk twitching. But something was different. The rangers could see it even from far away. It wasn't just one baby, it was two, twins. But even that wasn't the true shock. As Nalia turned, nuzzling the first calf, she paused. Her trunk lingered over the second. This one was smaller, but not weaker, just different. A rare pattern ran along its ears and down its trunk. It shimmered in the sun, almost silver. Lucas gasped. "That's not just any calf." Dr. Lena's voice cracked over the radio. "That's leucism, partial pigmentation loss. That calf is a silver elephant. A genetic rarity, one in millions. A silver-toned elephant calf, born in the wild." And here it was, standing wobbly but proud beside its brother, its skin glinting like moonlight over steel. Nalia, exhausted but alert, stood and circled her calves. She wrapped her trunk around both of them, gently but firmly, as if to say, "They're mine, they're safe." And in that moment, a quiet kind of magic settled across Etosha. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the wind waited, but not for long. As word spread across the conservation station, researchers, rangers, and volunteers began gathering at a respectful distance. Cameras clicked, radios buzzed, yet not a single person dared approach too closely. They knew this was something sacred, a moment that belonged entirely to Nalia and her calves. The silver calf, already nicknamed Shani, meaning marvel in the local dialect, struggled to stand. His legs trembled like reeds in the breeze. But every time he faltered, Nalia's trunk guided him upright again. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and filled with instinctual love. The way she leaned into him, the way she waited for his brother to nuzzle close, it was as if her body knew the rhythm of both hearts already. Nearby, a young ranger named Caleb whispered, "She knows how rare he is. She feels it." Dr. Lena nodded. "And she's protecting that knowledge with every breath." The silver calf's brother, a healthy and energetic bull named Quito, was already exploring nearby shrubs, occasionally circling his twin and bumping him with gentle curiosity. But Shani stayed close to Nalia. He was still adjusting to the world, to the brightness of the sun, to the touch of the wind, to the sound of his own heartbeat echoing through his fragile frame. Suddenly, a loud rustling stirred from the bush. A startled hyena, chased by a pair of wildebeests, darted across the clearing. In an instant, Nalia trumpeted, stepping between her calves and the threat. Her ears flared wide and her body surged with maternal power. Though the hyena meant no harm, the warning was clear. Not today, not to them. The hyena fled, tail tucked low. And once again, the clearing fell silent, save for the sound of two newborn elephants breathing beneath their mother's towering shadow. But it wasn't just any moment of peace. It was a living symbol of what was possible. For days afterward, Nalia remained in that clearing, not out of necessity but by choice, allowing the calves time to grow stronger, to find their legs beneath them. The silver calf, Shani, still wobbled, still struggled at times, but he was improving. Every day he took a few more steps without help, and every night he curled beneath his mother's chest, pressed tight against the steady drumbeat of her heart. Visitors from around the world began to arrive. Scientists, photographers, conservationists, all drawn by the whispers of something miraculous. Yet none of them expected what they saw, because Shani wasn't just surviving, he was glowing. His unusual coloring shimmered under the Namibian sun like polished moonlight, and with every small act, nudging his brother, mimicking Nalia's movements, he captured hearts in a way no one could fully explain. The staff at Etosha worked quickly to ensure the family's safety. Temporary barriers were placed at a respectful distance, giving them space without interruption. Water troughs and fresh branches were brought daily, but most days Nalia wanted none of it. She sought her own water. She guided her calves to her favorite shade trees. She was determined to raise them not in confinement, but in freedom, under open skies where their footsteps could still imprint the ancient soil. And all the while, Shani and Keto grew. By their third week, they were playing together. Keto always led, charging clumsily through the brush, ears flapping like sails, while Shani followed closely, slower but more focused, as if memorizing every step. And though Shani couldn't match his brother's strength, he made up for it in spirit. When Keto stumbled or got too far, it was Shani's trumpet, soft but clear, that called him back. Even Nalia seemed changed. Her movements were lighter, her eyes brighter. It was as though some ancient weight had been lifted, some grief or memory replaced by the present joy of what she had brought into the world. Because Shani, against all odds, was not just alive. He was thriving, and the entire herd knew it. Older matriarchs began circling closer during the evenings, not out of dominance but curiosity, sniffing Shani gently, brushing their trunks over his back as if to reassure themselves that he was real. Calves from other families watched him with wide eyes, drawn to his shimmer, his quiet resolve. Some even began imitating his slower, more deliberate movements, transforming what had once been a struggle into a new rhythm for the younger generation. But the most unexpected change came from the park's wild bulls. Solitary by nature and often unpredictable, these males rarely showed interest in newborns. Yet a massive bull named Tambo, scarred, wise, and long known to the researchers, began appearing more and more often near the clearing. Not aggressively, not as a threat, but as a silent guardian. He would stand nearby when Nalia led her calves to the waterhole. He would walk behind them when they ventured into thicker brush. And when lions roared in the distance one night, it was Tambo who trumpeted first, his call echoing across the plain like thunder. No one could explain it, but some believed Shani's birth had awakened something ancient, some memory of protection, of purpose beyond rivalry or rank, as if the herd had been waiting for him without knowing. By the second month, Shani had a reputation that stretched far beyond Etosha's borders. Articles were written, documentaries were proposed, but the staff made a quiet decision. There would be no tours, no cameras shoved in his face. This miracle, this quiet resilience, deserved something more sacred than spectacle. And so the family remained together in their corner of the park. Keto grew stronger, his tusks just beginning to bud. Shani remained smaller, his body still fragile in some ways. But his eyes, they held a depth and understanding that left many who saw him in tears. He wasn't just a baby elephant. He was living proof that difference was not weakness, that fragility, when held with care, could become something luminous. And in the hush of twilight, when the sun dipped below the savanna and the stars emerged like scattered embers, Nalea would pull her two sons close, one golden, one silver, and sway gently as if dancing with the wind itself. Because in that moment, with both of them breathing beside her, nothing else mattered. They were safe, they were whole, they were hers. And though the world outside Etosha spun on with its noise and haste, inside that clearing, cradled by acacia trees and the hush of tall grasses, time seemed to slow. There was no rush here, no race to become something, only the presence of breath, of being, of belonging. Each morning, Nalea would guide Shani and Keto toward the watering hole. The light would catch in Shani's pale skin like frost on morning leaves, making him look almost translucent in the golden haze. Birds would fall silent when he stepped into view, not out of fear, but reverence. Even the ground seemed to soften under his tiny feet. One day, as the family approached a familiar patch of land, Nalea stopped suddenly. Her ears tilted forward. A low vibration ran through the earth. It wasn't danger, it was memory. It was the exact spot where she had first collapsed in labor. Shani hesitated too, sensing the shift in his mother's breath. Then, without prompting, he moved forward, slowly, gently. He placed his trunk on the dry soil and let it rest there. His eyes closed. He didn't know what had happened here, not in words, not in stories, but something inside him bowed to the ground like it knew. Nalea watched him, stunned. It was as if he had heard the heartbeat of the land itself. Later that week, a sudden downpour drenched the plains. Most of the herd retreated under trees, but Nalea stayed in the open. She raised her trunk to the sky, welcoming the rain like an old friend. Shani stood beside her, blinking as the drops slicked his pale skin into a mirror. And Keto danced. For the first time since his brother's birth, Keto wasn't careful. He wasn't cautious. He just spun and trumpeted and ran, as if every fear he'd held in his chest had been washed away by the storm. That night, under a moon so full it cast shadows, Shani nestled between his brother and mother. Their bodies curved around him like wings. His breathing was steady, stronger than ever before. And Nalea, once the uncertain mother of a fragile miracle, closed her eyes and slept. Not lightly, not with one ear always raised, but fully, because she knew that whatever tomorrow brought, her sons would face it together. Not just as survivors, but as a new beginning, and that beginning echoed beyond their trio. The other elephants, those who once kept a protective distance from the pale calf, began to draw near. First came Nalezi, the matriarch, placing her trunk softly along Shani's back as he played in the dust. Then came others, older calves and mothers who circled them during migrations, letting the little ones watch how he walked, how he breathed. Shani never asked for the attention. He never demanded space. But wherever he stood, silence often followed. It wasn't the kind born of fear, but of awe. One evening, a young elephant who had lost her mother approached him. Her steps were hesitant, her eyes wide. Nalea watched carefully, ready to intervene if needed. But instead, Shani turned to the orphan and gently touched her forehead with his trunk. No words, no sounds, just presence. The young elephant leaned in and stayed there, as if she had been waiting for this very moment since her world had collapsed. Word spread, among rangers, among scientists, among local trackers who'd lived near Etosha their whole lives. They came with notebooks and cameras, expecting to document some rare genetic quirk, some unusual mutation. But when they stood in Shani's presence, when they saw how even birds circled lower above his head, or how anxious calves calmed around him, they stopped writing. They simply watched. One researcher said, "There's something ancient about him, like he remembers things he couldn't have lived through." Another whispered, "It's not just biology. It's something else, something older than language." Nalea didn't need the explanations. She only needed the way the earth hummed differently when Shani walked. And Keto, brave, fierce, once uncertain Keto, became his brother's silent protector. He stood by him in crowds, kept bullies away in play, and walked just behind him when crossing rivers. Their bond was no longer just survival, it was purpose. And as seasons turned and dry winds carried the scent of change across the plains, those who had doubted Shani's future began to see something else. Not weakness, not fragility, but prophecy. He wasn't born small to be pitied. He was born small to be seen, to be felt, to change everything without ever asking to. Because sometimes it wasn't the loudest that shaped history, it was the quiet ones, the still ones, the ones who simply were, with such undeniable presence, the world couldn't help but listen. Shani didn't lead marches. He didn't trumpet demands. He simply existed in a way that made others soften. Slow down. He reminded the herd what it meant to protect without fear, to stand still without weakness, to love without condition. By the time he turned one, stories of him had reached beyond Etosha. Pilots flying over the savannah would spot the pale calf at a distance, his white form like a ghost moving beside the larger dust-colored elephants. And they would radio in with awe. "Spotted the miracle again," they'd say, and those listening would understand. Shani had become more than a calf. He was a symbol, not of rarity, but of what happened when love wasn't limited to what was expected. When a mother like Nalia could hold space for something different. And when a brother like Keto could choose faith over fear. Visitors came from all over, some to understand, some just to witness, but all left changed. Because watching Shani wasn't just about seeing a rare elephant, it was about seeing yourself, in his small, strong steps, in his quiet, steady gaze, in the way he dared to be where he didn't seem to belong, and yet fit perfectly. And in that, something ancient stirred, not just in elephants, but in those watching silently from the edge of the trees, as if the world itself had been waiting for someone like him. Because every so often, nature doesn't just follow patterns, it rewrites them. And Shani was a rewrite, a quiet revolution wrapped in thick, pale skin and wide, curious eyes. He didn't roar or charge or defy expectations through noise. He did it by simply existing, gently, persistently, lovingly. The other calves began mimicking him, not his color, of course, but his behavior. They grew calmer, more patient, more inclined to wait beside a frightened bird or a limping tortoise, the way Shani once had. Rangers noticed fewer injuries among the young, less competition at waterholes, more cohesion in the herd. It was as though Shani's energy was contagious, not by force, but by invitation. And Nalea, now older, walked a little slower. Not out of weakness, but out of reverence. She had carried a mystery inside her once, a life unlike any she'd seen before. And now that life walked beside her, reminding everyone what compassion looked like on four legs. Even Keto, who had once feared the unknown, became a leader. The kind that watched before acting, that listened before speaking, that remembered what it meant to be the brother of a miracle. His bond with Shani never faded. In fact, it deepened with time. They were rarely apart, side by side in storms and drought, in migration, in rest. And perhaps that's what made Shani more than rare. Not just that he was pale, but that he was present, fully, bravely, lovingly, the kind of presence that didn't ask the world to change. It just made the world want to. Because when Shani stood under the acacia trees, dust swirling gently around his pale feet, animals gathered, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of peace. Birds rested near his massive legs. Warthogs napped within the curve of his shadow. Even predators passing from a distance didn't disturb the quiet that seemed to hum around him. As though every heartbeat within that space remembered something older than instinct, something sacred. Rangers from other regions came to Etosha just to witness him, not for spectacle, but to understand. To stand in the presence of something that had no words, no warning signs, just stillness that changed people. A softness so deep it challenged their own beliefs about strength. And Shani never noticed the awe. He wasn't trying to be different. He wasn't trying to lead or heal or transform. He was simply living as he was born to be, gentle, watchful, connected. And in that, He reminded every creature around him, elephant, bird, ranger, or child, that perhaps the greatest power in the world was tenderness. Even Nalia, now walking slower, would often pause and turn to look at him, not with surprise, but with gratitude. Her eyes would linger on the way he interacted with the world. Careful, never rushed, never harsh, and she'd realize that while she had given birth to him, he had given something back to the world, a blueprint, not of strength or size or superiority, but of what it looks like to carry the unfamiliar with love, to step gently when the world expects thunder, to be kind, even when no one is watching. And that legacy was already echoing beyond the park. In small sanctuaries miles away, caregivers spoke his name in hushed admiration, telling new volunteers about the gentle bull who guarded 2 lives with a patience rarely seen. In classrooms, children watched clips of Shawnee and whispered questions not about his size, but about his heart. And somewhere, in a distant reserve, a young ranger wiped away a tear and wondered if he too could lead with gentleness, not force. Tourists no longer came just for sightings. They came with notebooks, with sketch pads, with stories. They stood in silence, hoping to witness the same moment of grace they had seen on screen. A moment when a giant animal chose to shield something smaller, something fragile, not because he had to, but because he could. And Nalia, she never left his side again. Though her spine curved with age and her steps grew slow, she moved through the savannah like a queen, always near the son who had become a myth. And whenever someone asked about him, about how a bull elephant came to be so revered, she'd simply say, with eyes full of memory, he was born different, but what made him special wasn't what he carried in the womb. It was what he chose to carry after. Because Shawnee didn't just protect, he remembered. Every soft cry of a calf too weak to keep up, every tremble in Nalea's body when distant thunder rolled across the plains. He felt it all, and each time he positioned himself not ahead of the herd as most bulls would, but beside them, among them, with them. He was their shadow in the heat, their shield in the storm, their silence when fear roared too loudly. Other bulls, distant and solitary by nature, began to approach more often, not to challenge, but to observe, as if something in them stirred too, as if watching Shawnee reminded them of something they'd once forgotten. That strength wasn't the absence of feeling, but the presence of it, fiercely and without shame. One dusk, when the sun melted into the trees like fire into amber, a young orphaned elephant calf stumbled into the herd's path. Motherless, nameless, trembling. Shawnee didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for the matriarch's signal. He simply lowered his head, extended his trunk, and curled it around the calf's frail body as if to say, "You're safe, you're home." And just like that, the herd opened, shifted, welcomed. Because what Shawnee gave them wasn't just leadership, it was a new memory of what leadership could look like. Not through dominance, not through loud trumpets or dramatic displays of power, but through presence, through stillness, through the quiet, steady heartbeat of compassion. And over time, the landscape began to shift, subtly like wind changing direction. Herds once rigid in tradition became more fluid. Calves were no longer corralled by only their mothers, but by a collective warmth. Older bulls, once distant and aloof, began to linger longer, to play, to listen. The Great Plain became not just a place of survival, but of healing. One evening, as moonlight bathed Etosha in silver, Nalia stood at the water's edge, her newborn tucked safely under her. Shawnee stood a few paces away, not guarding, not commanding, just being. The calf stumbled forward and pressed its tiny trunk against his thick leg, and Shawnee, with all the tenderness of a creature who had once lost everything, bent down and wrapped his trunk, not just around the calf, but around the future. Because what he had carried through loneliness, he now offered to others through love. And in doing so, he rewrote not just his story, but the very rhythm of the herd. The calf blinked up at him, its tiny eyes filled with innocence, with wonder, with a kind of trust only the newborn possess. Shawnee didn't look away. He held that gaze steady as stone, soft as moss. And something passed between them, something ancient, wordless and true. Behind them, the herd had grown quiet, not from fear or caution, but reverence. Every mother, every auntie, every young bull who had once doubted him now saw not just a male elephant, but the memory of every father who should have stayed, the protector they never expected to appear and never wanted to lose again. Shawnee didn't trumpet. He didn't need to. The way he stood, solid, scarred, and still, spoke louder than sound. His trunk brushed the calf's head again, and then gently guided it back toward Nalia, like a river returning to its course. And the calf, so new to the world, so unaware of what it meant to be born into something rare, paused only once before turning to nuzzle its mother, as if knowing it had not one heart watching over it, but two. That night, as stars blinked open over the vast Namibian plain, the herd slept closer than usual. Mothers curled around calves. Young bulls laid in the grass without their usual distance. And at the center of them all, Shawnee stood awake, half in shadow, half in moonlight. Not because he feared danger, but because love had made him vigilant, because grief had made him wise, because when you've waited your whole life to protect something sacred, you don't sleep on it. At dawn, the first rays of sunlight poured over Etosha like a blessing, painting the savanna in gold. Nalia stirred, her trunk gently curled around her newborn. The little one yawned, blinked, and then reached, not just for her mother, but for the towering shadow beside her. Shawnee. He didn't flinch. He simply lowered his trunk again, brushing the calf's tiny head with the same tenderness that had once been stripped from his own childhood. And in that moment, one small touch, one simple act, something healed. Not just in him, but in the herd, in the legacy of all who had come before. Rangers watching from a distance recorded the scene in silence. One, with tears quietly streaming down her face, whispered, "He stayed." Because he had, when no one expected him to, when instinct said leave, when the wild said don't. He had stayed, not just to witness life, but to hold it. And as the herd began to move again, this time with Shawnee at the center, not the edge, it became clear that this wasn't just a rare birth. It was a rebirth of trust, of tribe, of what it truly means to belong. If this story touched you, share it, because sometimes the ones who stay rewrite what survival truly means.